I've been getting some questions about commentary, how to get into it, and what tips I might have for commentators for a while now. And there's a lot that I have to say on the subject, but I've also always been in the position of not really feeling like that much of a Splatoon commentator. Like, if you're gonna. Obviously, I have commentated a bunch of tournaments and stuff, but if you're going to call me something in the community, it's usually not that. It's more often like content creator, at most analyst. There are some people who have more experience with this, who have studied this more. There are people who it's more their thing. There's even, broadcast journalism is a college major. That's a thing that people go to school to learn how to do. And I've never done anything like that. So it never felt quite like my wheelhouse per se. But I've now reached a point where I feel like I have a reasoned critique to make of the direction that Splatoon commentary is going, that I think deserves a little bit more of a sort of casting 101 as context and backup for what I'm going to be saying there. So this will be in part leading up to a critique that I have of the existing model that we've been using for a lot of commentary on Splatoon majors and whatnot. And it's also going to be a bit of a primer and some advice for people who are trying to get into commentary, because I need to establish some of those basics before I can really talk about what it is that I want to see us doing differently. To start with, like I said, I'm not a professional broadcaster. I haven't gone to school for it, but here's what I have done. In 2012, I started commentating Melee events. Those were just like local Melee events at our college, but I was solo casting at those events, and I think that was really important and formative for me as a caster, because it put me in a position where I had to fill all of the dead air. It was just me that was going to be there. And so if I wasn't saying words, it was going to be awkward silence, and I had to get used to being able to fill all of those gaps and always have things to say. And I think that was really helpful both for me as a commentator and also as a teacher later on, as someone who needs to speak to people in a professional setting. And as a streamer, that was also really valuable for that. And I started casting, way back then, was doing Melee casts for a good long time. I casted MVG Sandstorm, which was a major, granted one that didn't go particularly well. And so I've gotten a pretty high level of commentary experience from the Melee community, at least up to like the regional level or so, which is relatively big. And since then, I took that experience over to Splatoon and have done some larger events, usually in the context of being an analyst, and typically that's what people are bringing me on for these days, rather than to do the sort of play-by-play color commentary we're talking about, to actually be someone that I get swapped to in between games, doing more of a kind of production studio style of jumping back and forth between people. We'll talk about all of that stuff later. But I do have some experience in this, even though it's not, my formal professional training or anything like that. There may be some things that I'm talking about that are, patently obvious to people who have that sort of experience. But I do think that I bring some perspective that is informed by having done it myself. To start with, let's talk about a question that I think is really interesting, actually, even though it's really basic, which is, how many people should you have on commentary at the same time? How many people should be talking at once? What I started with was one. I was the only person who was up there. Now, this has a couple of downsides. You don't tend to see this in a lot of professional productions, and that's for a couple of reasons. One of them is that you have to maintain all the momentum as a solo commentator. You can't let there be dead air, which means you always have to be talking. You're going to tire your voice out faster doing that, and only hearing one voice at a time is something that can often tire out the listener. It's something you kind of get fatigued on hearing that same person, and hearing somebody else interject can be some nice. It can be a nice little shift, a nice change in the tone, in perspective. It lets you also hear different perspectives on the game. If people tend not to disagree with your other commentators, but you can at least hear somebody else's ideas. Two heads are better than one kind of thing. But one thing that I did really like about solo commentary was that The pacing of it is really easy. You control when you crescendo, you control when you decide to switch subjects, you decide, oh, that was important, let's talk about that. And nobody can stop you from deciding what it is you're going to talk about. Another huge advantage is that you will never talk over anybody because there's nobody else to talk over. One problem of having multiple people on the mic is that it's really difficult to hear and understand what's being said, and also really annoying to the listener when two people are talking over each other. That's a situation you always want to avoid, asterisk, most of the time want to avoid. And so with solo commentary, you never have to worry about it. For those who may think, okay, but why would you ever do solo commentary? I propose that a streamer is a solo commentator. Like, just think of any VTuber you've ever seen. Think of, your XQCs, your Pokemains, your biggest streamers on Earth kind of thing. Are they not just having a thing in front of them and giving solo commentary a lot of the time? Sure, maybe they may bring their friends in, and then it's a different experience where they're, hanging out with their friends and chatting with them, and maybe sometimes they're bringing the audience into it a little bit. But when something's happening and they're playing it, they're basically just doing solo commentary. They're maybe self-commentating. You look at like a Markiplier Let's Play or something, where he's freaking out at some horror game, and he's just narrating everything that's going on. You think about that like a sportscaster, and it's not that different of a task what he's doing. He's filling the dead air and giving you the emotional beats and the energy of that situation. So I think that that's underexplored in esports, but I can also definitely see the production group's reasons for wanting to avoid that and put more people on the mic. One last thing I guess I will say about it is that if you have solo commentary, that means fewer people get to commentate. And if you're trying to train up people on commentary, they're not going to be able to follow each other's example as easily if they don't have someone that more experienced that they're paired with that they can learn from. And you're also not practicing building synergy for a situation where you're not going to be solo commentating. And the one thing that really bit me in the butt as a solo commentator was not learning to talk over each other, even when we were duo commentating. So let's move on to that, duo commentating. The challenge of duo commentating over solo, like we've talked about, is that you have to avoid talking over each other. So you can't just start talking about the same thing at the same time. But duo commentary is still very manageable in that regard, because all that has to happen is for one person to stop speaking, and then the only other person who's available to fill the dead air is the duo commentator. So it's pretty obvious for the other to take over if you're not just putting weird random pauses into the middle of what you're saying. As long as you keep your speech at a normal cadence and give a reasonable amount of time in your pauses when you're trying to indicate for your partner to step in, and just keep talking when you don't want your partner to step in, like, you can manage that without many like verbal cues or anything like that. Like, you typically don't need to tell your partner it's time for them to speak. You don't need to be like prompting them to speak. You can just say what you're going to say, stop saying things, and then let them say what they've been waiting to say. So that tends to work out really well in an environment where you can't see each other and have nonverbal communication over how to speak about it. It works pretty well that way. Something that makes duo commentary even easier is the distinction between different roles for commentators. In a professional context, you're going to get your play-by-play guy who is generally like a professional broadcast journalist. And there are a bunch of exceptions to these rules that I'm pointing out. These are just kind of like the way that things tend to be and the reason that they tend to be that way. This professional broadcast journalist, their entire job is to bring the energy of the situation to the audience. They're there to talk about what plays are being made. They're there to talk about, if you're listening on the radio, this is the guy who's telling you what is currently happening. Drops down into center field, running around to first. Is he going to round to second? He's rounding to second. That kind of thing where if you're watching the game, you don't need to hear that, you already know it's going on. Like, it's not like the factual information they're sharing is that meaningful to you, but the energy of the thing kind of buoys people along. And for people who are less familiar with the game, it draws their attention to the things that a more seasoned watcher of that game are paying attention to. Here are the plays that are being made right now, the decisions that are being made right now that matter, that might be different, that are unexpected, or that are exactly according to expectations, but that are what are determining who is winning and losing, what's going on. So it's not that it's not informative at all. You need to know the game well enough to be able to communicate effectively what it is that's important about what's happening right in front of you. But then you pair that commentator with an analyst or with someone who's really, really experienced. Like, you get someone who is a professional baseball player who just retired last year, like, put them on the mic. They know everybody's names, man. They know... Forget knowing the game really well on a fundamental level. Like, they know everyone's style. They know the game plan everyone's coming up with. They know what strategies all the teams are running just because they've been there already. Like, they're more knowledgeable than anybody on the couch is ever going to be. And that sort of a knowledgeable commentator can really ground the cast in a way that someone on the couch just can't argue with. This is the color commentator. So the play-by-play commentator, you know, they might be getting into it and calling play-by-play and getting excited about it and crescendoing up and building up to a certain point. But at some point, they can only yell so loud. At some point, you can only get so excited about a thing before it's like, okay, dude, that's not really that big of a deal anymore. Sure, they hit a home run, and that's extremely exciting, but there have been a lot of home runs that have been hit in the history of baseball. And at some point, you've got to come down from that high. And while you're coming down from that, the color commentator is an excellent person to chime in to try and reestablish a little bit of balance in the energy levels, to bring us back down so that when the next crescendo happens, it really hits, instead of just trying to stay turned up to 11 for all of that time. So the color commentator is there to be informative. The color commentator is there to ground what the play-by-play guy is saying, especially if they're a little bit less knowledgeable about the game. The color commentator is there to change the pacing up, to give a different perspective, to keep the audience from getting tired of hearing one voice, and to give them another voice to listen to. This is a very tried and true pairing. It's definitely not a necessary thing to maintain 100% of the time. A lot of the time, I actually like the casts better when individual casters are able to do both, and they switch from one to the other depending on the situation, not depending on who's talking. But given an environment where you're working with someone you've never commentated with before, it can be helpful to have these roles delineated so that you know generally what your job is, and you can just focus on doing that one thing instead of having to also figure out how you fit into that synergy. Once we go past duo commentary, things get messy, because with duo commentary, if you stop talking, it's obvious who else is supposed to start talking again. With trio commentary, though, you stop talking, one of two different people could start chiming in at that point. And so it's here that we really have to start involving some structure in the way that we're casting in order to avoid two people starting to talk at the same time and clashing with each other. Because as a caster, like, you start talking, somebody else starts talking, how do you know who's supposed to continue? You're both casters, you both have the confidence to just kind of keep saying things. But if you both stop and falter, if you both just keep talking over each other, that's a disaster. Now, nothing is happening. The idea has been cut off. We're losing time. There's dead air, or there's air where people are being annoyed because two people are talking at once. That's a big problem. So, to avoid those collisions, you need something in place to avoid them. One possible option is to have nonverbal communication. And this is what you see on Riot's LCS casts. When they have like three people casting, they're all standing right next to each other with a single screen in front of all of them that they're all watching at the same time. And what you'll often see them doing when they actually show videos of those casts is one person who's not speaking will reach out their hand and tap the like edge of the screen, or just put their hand out there. And what that means to the other casters is, I have something to say. It will pass to me when you're done speaking.
Everyone was wondering, like, why are they tapping the ground? Why are they tapping that? No, it's literally just, if you have something to say and you want to add to that person, is to let them know that they can wrap up their point, because you want to expand on it, and it works pretty well.
So he'll either be tapping in, saying I got something to say, so we'll be both okay,
Or
pass it to
circling,
him.
he's coming in.
Yeah, or if he's got nothing to say, I'll just pass it to Joe, and we'll just carry on the flow until he's got something that is seriously important.
That way, they don't have to talk about who's going to talk next. They can just know visually who's going to talk next, and it sounds seamless on the broadcast because you're not seeing them make these weird nonverbal cues that would otherwise look like, what are they doing? This is not a part of normal conversation. One option is to actually mention the next person that is going to speak by name. You forecast who it is that's going to speak, or you ask a question of someone so that it's clear who's being spoken to and who should respond, so that the third person knows it's not your turn yet, it'll be your turn next, or something like that. And that's one way that we've done it in the past. The other way is just to let it rock. And I've seen that work on some more casual, more like grassroots focused casts, where, getting multiple people to talk over each other, it's just like you're in a room with your friends, right? Your friends are going to talk over each other sometimes. That's just the way that people have conversations. So it can work that way if that's just a part of the aesthetic. If you're okay with it being a little bit less polished, a little more scuffed, and these are just cool people hanging out that are funny, and you want to get to know better, and you want it to feel like you're in the room with them being their friend. Once you get to 4+, it's going to get really chaotic. Now, they do still do this on some professional broadcasts. For example, there are a lot of like NFL broadcasts where, especially outside of the main show of the game itself, when they're doing like an analyst desk sort of thing, they'll send it over and there'll be like 4 professional football players or former professional football players who are all there talking, and they'll pass the idea from one to the next still sometimes, but other times you'll hear reactions from the other guys, like they'll maybe laugh at something that they say, they'll maybe kind of riff on each other's jokes in the way that you would have with that informal everybody on the couch sort of idea. But another thing that's a really important staple of this is that they're often in a studio together, and so they're having that conversation face to face. It's not even that they're looking at something else while they do this. A lot of the time, this is more a situation that you're going to get for in between the matches, and there they can actually look each other in the eye and have a conversation like normal human beings, instead of having to look at the camera, or instead of having to look at the video game that's happening that they're supposed to be talking about. So at that point, is it really commentary what I'm talking about? It's broadcasting, I guess. But that kind of gives you an idea of like how that scales up and what new problems get introduced with different numbers of people that are commentating. When you're having that conversation face to face, you have a lot more, nonverbal cues you can work with. But I think it is absolutely possible to run something like duo or even trio commentary without having the nonverbal cues, without even, having the forecasting, and to still develop a synergy with your casters to the point where you know whose job it is to speak next. You have kind of your role, and you don't really need to indicate who's going to talk next. You can kind of just work around each other. I think it is possible to get to that level, but it's definitely very difficult, and especially if you're going to be mixing and matching your cast members. If they're not going to get really, really used to casting that way, then they may not know where all the holes are, and you're probably going to run into some collisions there. So that's the number of casters. So how does this play into the Splatoon community? What I feel we've been shifting towards more and more as time has gone on is Nintendo's style of commentary on specifically their Splatoon broadcasts. Let me explain. When we first started getting Nintendo events, when they first got competitive Splatoon on the Nintendo's official channel, they brought on 3 people. They brought on Jordan Kent, Ashley Escada, pardon me if I'm mispronouncing that last name, and nine whole grains from the competitive community. And they put those 3 people up on screen, and basically the way that this kind of functioned was that there was one main broadcaster, who was always Jordan Kent, who would introduce everything. They'd lead in. They'd say, "Welcome back, everybody, to the Nintendo Insert Splatoon event here, invitational thingy. And we are joined here by Nine and Ashley, as always, to talk about some great Splatoon." And then the crucial part here is that he will say, "Nine, what do you think our competitors are feeling going into this event?" What he does there is he always mentions the next person who's going to talk by name. It's a very rigid structural element to make it so that there are no collisions, so that nobody's going to talk over each other. That has been sort of something that we've been shifting to as a community. A lot of people are starting to do 3-person broadcasts, and kind of having this sort of structural role be a part of it. Where before we might have gone more for duo casts, I think there's more people who are trying out these tri-casts, maybe as a training ground to get other casters up the ladder to be able to cast other Nintendo tournaments, to get them practice in that format. Because I think that's valuable. If we want those casters to have that as a possible part of their career, to be able to do the Nintendo casts, then they want to get practice in the format that Nintendo is going to use. So I think that's valuable for that reason. But I think that this structure has a much more specific use case that we may be overlooking a little bit. We'll talk about that a little bit more, but first what I want to do is compare the Nintendo-style commentary idea to some other points of reference. So we'll start with esports shoutcasting, which is obviously what all of this really is. There's a typical sports broadcast, which has been a tradition for some significant amount of time, but the esports shoutcast has taken on kind of its own ethos and defined itself a little bit as a different style from what you'd see on a sports broadcast. So first of all, at a high level with esports shoutcasting, I'm talking my biggest point of reference here is the LCS, or just the kind of Riot Games group of casters. Anybody who's going to be casting League of Legends Worlds is kind of who I'm talking about. Those guys, to me, are the ESPN of esports. They have brought this up to as high a level as just about any other community. And there are certainly, the Counter-Strike people are very experienced. There are, a lot of other games that definitely have pretty close to that caliber. Lots of the Valve games, Dota, CS. You've also got Rocket League, has a strong tradition of casting. So it's not like this is the only game that's out there that's up at that caliber, but it is the biggest esport on Earth. This is the esport that's as big or bigger than the Super Bowl. So they, I think, are kind of the gold standard that I'm always comparing our stuff to. So at the high level, they're often performing in a studio, and they're able to do the nonverbal communication there. Like League of Legends, like I said, was the example I was talking about with putting your hand on the screen to indicate that you want to speak. And something about esports shoutcasting is that people expect really, really high energy at the key moments. They don't, want you yelling at them all the time, but they're really looking for that Spanish goal kind of excitement coming out of whatever major moment is happening.
You can see there's coming in there. Peke is desperately up towards the Nexus. Kevin is going to be able to go towards him. He's trying to do it, but meanwhile they're in the base. Yellow Star's trying to defend them in the base. Peke is trying to take the Nexus down. Is anyone going to be able to deal with this one? Catches him with another axe. He's very low. They're pushing on the Nexus to him. Peke's back to back. I do not believe it. Peke's stuck in there. Catching it. Takes down the Nexus. But now he's going crazy. That game was amazing.
That was the best thing I have seen in the entire history of League of Legends.
And that's something that you don't always see in mainstream sports broadcasting. A lot of those casters are a lot more reserved. They'll get emphatic, they'll get excited like this, but they're not going to be blowing their voices out with that sort of casting. They're not going to be yelling. They're not going to be shouting over each other. And that is a height to which esports shoutcasters definitely do get. Play-by-play people at this top level of commentary are going to be able to talk really fast and get really loud and be able to stay really loud and have strong voices, because they're going to start right here. And oh my god, they're making this play. This play is starting to develop, and I'm starting to see that this is going to be really significant. And they're going to be able to build this up, and they're going to be able to name the names of the characters and name the names of the moves that they're using in very quick succession with each other. And oh my god, they pulled it off. I cannot believe it. The reversal has happened, everybody. You know, they're going to show you the interest curve with their volume, with their intensity. The color commentator, in the meantime, is going to kind of punctuate these pieces, and they're going to match that energy. They're still going to be loud themselves. They might even just be interrupting in some cases, or talking over it, or in between sentences they get something in there while the color commentator keeps going, just to keep building this crescendo to play off each other. It's like, think of somebody who does music with a looper pedal. They start with just like the bass line and the rhythm section or something, and then each new layer that they add in adds a little bit of interest until you're getting into something that's really cool. And the color commentator can be one of those additional voicings, so to speak. They can kind of add layers of intensity on top of what's already being put in there. And they can also draw your attention to something that's really important that happened, while the play-by-play person is just going to breeze by it because they have to talk about what just happened. That's kind of what you expect out of an esports shoutcast. It's passion for the game that is erupting into chaos when something remarkable happens. I think that there is value in these situations, specifically in people talking over each other in very specific circumstances. I think that there are some collisions that you can orchestrate, some dissonance that you can create that actually will be musical, so to speak. Talking over each other, first of all, gives the impression that these casters are so excited that they just can't help themselves and they have to say something about it. And that is a sense that it communicates to the audience that's really powerful. Another aspect of this is that the play-by-play person doesn't have to stop their momentum at all, because someone else can just chime in. It's like someone saying yeah in between lines of a hip-hop song. Just filling that beat. It's like a drum fill or something like that. When you know that the soloist, the guitar player, is giving you an opening and you just interject a little something there. There is a lot of connection between this and music because there is really a rhythm to it. And so thinking about it in those terms, I think, can really be helpful. It is important, though, as a shoutcaster, to know that you are right on the edge of what is too much for people, of what is overstimulating, over what is just loud noise. And it takes a very seasoned caster to know how to toe that line and how close to it to go, to be able to get to screaming and have actually earned it, and get back down afterward and not have just like lost your voice and lost your ethos. There are some times, where I've seen, some LCS casters, they're talking about how, and this team drives the dagger in, and they've just committed a massacre against the enemy team. They've burned their crops and they're razing their fields and salting the earth. Like, it's not that serious. They're beating them at League of Legends, right? Sometimes it can get a little over the top. And also, some people will look at these shoutcasters and they'll look at like the top 10 shoutcasting moments, and they'll see the highlight reel, right? And they'll hear, oh, it's exciting when loud. Therefore, let's be loud. But what they're not realizing is that those loud moments are earned by the quiet moments that came before them. It's not just loud is exciting. It's, oh God, wait, something's happening. I think something's happening right now. We start quiet but intense. And that gets someone like, ooh, something's happening. And then you build on that a little bit and they're, something's happening. You have to build from something to get to loud, because otherwise you're just loud and there's no contrast. And it's the contrast that really conveys the meaning of that excitement, that we were at this energy level, but now we're at this energy level. That going from one to the other is really what's exciting about it, not that we got to this loud place in the first place. Energy, excitement is measurable not from decibel level, but by deviation from your baseline energy level. If you just start loud, then you have nowhere to go. There's no difference, and no excitement is generated, really. You're just being loud. But if you start at a normal speaking volume, and then suddenly the intensity increases, and then suddenly you start to get louder, and you blow up and explode with excitement as soon as something happens in the game, now it's that thing from the game that triggered that change, and that peak in the volume, that peak in the intensity, the excitement, it's tied to that intensity and excitement of the game. It's showing that the game is what's exciting you. It's showing your passion for what's happening. And that, I think, is what's really at the root of why loudness works. There's definitely a point at which it's too much, and there's also a point at which too much excitement can appear non-genuine. It has to be something that the person is really feeling, really getting excited about, because otherwise, if they're just going to get excited about every single thing that happens, if an absolutely meaningless win in the regular season, because both of them are still going to the playoffs either way, if that win is as exciting to you as someone winning the World Series, there's something there that's a little bit of a disconnect. It's harder to buy into getting excited about something that's legitimately worth being excited about if you're giving them the same level of appreciation. There is definitely something to building up an event that's seen as a little bit less exciting, and you can definitely do that with broadcasting, but you also have to be, realistic enough that someone can buy that that's your authentic feeling about it. Let's talk about what we can get from sports broadcasting, because while this is a little bit more dissimilar from Splatoon, it is also kind of the origin of esports shoutcasting, and there are some elements of it that are underexplored in esports or not used in esports that it's worthwhile, I think, for us to think about, to come at this from a different perspective and be able to innovate in our own field. So first of all, sports, at big moments, there's a lot more that you can add to the broadcast than just what the casters are saying. Because even, relatively small sporting events, just a regular season professional baseball game, maybe like, week 5 or something, there are still going to be thousands of people in the stadium that are going to react to whatever happens. They're there, they're drunk, they're there to have a good time, they're going to yell when someone hits a home run. And so sometimes the casters aren't the most exciting thing. Like, sometimes one person's voice isn't going to compete with what thousands of people are yelling. Sometimes the best thing that a caster can do in one of these big sporting events is to punctuate what happens and then step back and be silent for 10 seconds at a time and just let everyone soak in the moment. Let everyone hear the crowd. Let everyone see the players celebrating. Let madness ensue for a little while before it comes back to the casters and they ground us again and they decrescendo from there.
Zone, it is caught for the win! Richard Rodgers with a walk-off touchdown. A game ender for the Packers.
That's something that is less common in esports, because it's less common in esports that you're going to have a large enough crowd that there's considerable crowd noise that's worth being lost in. And there are definitely situations like that, but sometimes the audio setup isn't in place for the crowd to be heard. You don't hear the crowd noise. Nobody tries to work that into the mix. So I think that that's something that's worthwhile to consider. Another aspect of sports broadcasting that we can bring in is that there are additional roles that we don't really have so much of, or that we've underexplored, I think. One of the big ones that I really want us to, I'm going to keep harping on this until it keeps happening in majors, is the role of the sideline reporter. Think about how a caster might say, over to you, Sally, and then there's Sally right there on the sidelines of the football field with the microphone in the face of the head coach. They're there in the moment instead of in a studio someplace else, or on a Discord call in our case, halfway across the country. They're there on the location to talk to the people directly. Now, obviously with an online tournament that's hard to simulate, but I do think that there is room for an interview format sort of thing, where like after a game is done and while players are still waiting to find their next match, you just be like on Discord, hey, you top player who just played in that match, could I get a comment from you really quickly for the stream? And then you patch that person in, get them on the mic and hear their perspective. I think that's going to be really helpful for building storylines. That's going to be helpful for players building a brand and, you know, learning this kind of ability to speak in front of the camera, ability to represent themselves, that I think could be valuable experience for them. What I want people to look back on are the Big House interviews. When last Big House we had, the major where the game had just came out and people were trying GooTuber and it was wild. They had interviews. They had an interview table where I think it was Mizuno and I think we had, was it Vicfion? I think it was Vicfion also who was on the mic there, and just putting the mic up to Chara being like, GooTuber, why? And Chara was able to answer that. And I made a video out of that. And it made for a great conversation piece. And it gave an identity to that weapon. It gave an identity to that team that was trying it. There was a lot to talk about there. And it was really cool. And it gave us a lot of information. It was very entertaining. I want more of that sort of thing because I think that there's a lot about the game and a lot about the community that's playing it that we could open up to outside audiences if we get that person, those feet on the ground there to interview them about it. Another aspect of this is kind of the studio host, the presenter. This is more common for you to see on like cable TV, where you have a TV network and their job is to, you know, bring you to the stadium in a sense, that you came to their channel, but from their channel, they're walking you down the hallway to the football stadium. Is sort of the idea. It was a way, you know, early on in television when people didn't have that same sort of like spatial understanding, that you could communicate to people that the programming you're about to see is different or it's not here, but like we are your gateway to it. What that also did was it built the brand of the network, because now the network itself, this guy in a studio who doesn't really know that much about football, he's still involved in the production of showing you the football. And when the football is over, the implication is you come back to the network because that's, you know, what brought you there in the first place. And then they take you somewhere else and get to show you more advertisements because now you're watching their really stupid cop drama or something that they're showing right after the show to try and get bigger numbers, bigger ratings off the back of the momentum that they've built from having this big sporting event there. So that's a little bit underexplored because you don't tend to see networks running tournaments. But if someone were to try a brand exercise like that where they are bringing you to a tournament but then bringing you back and having something else to show you and getting more watch time out of the audience that way and being able to build their influencers by putting them in right after the big game, I feel like there's some potential there that's a little bit underexplored, and it might be something that's worth looking into. Some more niche things here. There are some times where you get specialized analysts, and this, again, you need a pretty big crew to be able to have this sort of thing. This is getting up to a high professional level. But, for example, on sports broadcasts, you'll also often have people who are very intimately familiar with the rules. Rules referees, people who know the rule book back and forth, who are certified to be refs, on staff, just in case there's some niche ruling in a sports game that needs looking after. In esports, that's a lot less common to happen because in esports, the rules of the game are hard-coded. It's not like you can possibly break them. They're like laws of physics more than they are something that you're following on the honors system. So it's a little bit less of an important thing there, but what you do tend to see in the high-level, like LCS broadcasts, for example, is that you've got a whole bunch of researchers behind the scenes who are shoveling statistics and information to the casters, especially to prep them before the cast. But if something relevant comes up in the middle of it, you can put it up on their screen, you can pass them a note or something, and now they have that extra talking point, and that's some extra value that those casters can bring that they hadn't brought to the cast themselves. Finally, and this is getting really off the walls here, if you look at something like the WWE, which isn't really a competitive environment anymore, it's more entirely showmanship, entirely performance, there the role of the commentator shifts because now in this kind of fictional setting, you can make characters of your casters. They're not real people representing their brand. These are people who you can build a storyline around. You can write plot points for them. You can have a script for these people to follow. And in those kinds of situations, you can set them up so, for example, they align with the wrestlers. In kayfabe, there's the face, which is a person who is meant to be liked by the audience, and then a heel, someone who's meant to be disliked, the villain that the heroes have to triumph over. And you can align the casters a little bit so that they're just slightly biased towards one or the other, and you start to pick up on that as time goes on. And that can kind of drive the divide between the two and make it more climactic between the two. Hearing that it's a split opinion between the two casters, which one they prefer to win. So there's a lot more leeway you get once it becomes a more creative exercise like that. But obviously, in a competitive environment, favoritism is generally frowned upon. There are definitely some cases where I think the emphasis that favoritism need not be there, I think sometimes it's overblown. Like, you look at, again, going back to the Riot casts, when the EU casters are casting Fnatic, the top European team in a lot of cases, it's either Fnatic or G2 most of the time there. If they're casting Fnatic versus the top Korean team in the world in League of Legends World Finals, they're going to get excited when the EU team wins. You can't expect them not to be. And it would be non-genuine for them not to be excited in that kind of a situation, because that's just not who they are, and everybody knows it. I think that there are ways that you can, be fair to the other side while still supporting people who are your friends, showing that bias in ways that don't interfere with or become annoying to the cast. I'm known sometimes in broadcasts for being like, all right, so no bias whatsoever, but let's go, Grillers, let's go. Okay. Anyway, back to the match. Showing that you have personal investment in that match, even though you're not going to let that into the broadcast so much, even though you're not going to trash talk the other team, even though you're not going to, overhype the one team at the expense of what the other team does well. As long as you're being fair in the broadcast, I think having your personal opinions known can be okay. But that sort of favoritism can become more of a feature than an issue if you're creating this sort of fictional environment for it. So, taking all of that in and going back to the way that Nintendo does commentary. Nintendo commentary, I would evaluate as polished, but not as exciting as the typical esports shoutcast. The pacing, as controlled by... Let's start talking about the individual casters that they bring on, because I think it is important to talk about their individual roles. Typically on a Nintendo broadcast, you're going to have Jordan Kent, you're going to have Nine, and then you're going to have someone else. And that someone else has been different across, from one point in time to another. These days, I'm happy that they've been bringing in more competitive Splatoon players, competitive Splatoon casters. We've seen Milana do this. We've seen Shiny Hunter Zach. We've seen Falco. We've seen Rissa. So, lots of people here who we know that are a part of the community, that have played on competitive teams, that know what they're talking about. They've been putting a lot more of those people into the cast. When we started off, it was Nine, it was Jordan Kent, and it was Ashley, who is a journalist that they brought on. And the choice of Nintendo to have some people who are not in the competitive Splatoon community, I think makes a lot of sense. Like, I don't want to bash Jordan or Ashley here, because I think they do actually play a pretty reasonable role from the perspective of Nintendo here at the very least. Jordan Kent has done professional sports commentary. They're a bigger name in broadcasting than any of us will ever be, and have talked to audiences that we will never, talk to. And that level of experience is something they can bring to the cast, and that allows them to be entertaining and to be a valuable structural element to the cast without having to know as much about the game up front. And to Jordan's credit, he has also gone on to learn a lot about the game as time has gone on. Like, you compare his very first tournament that he ever casted, where, he's learning things about the win condition, he's learning things about tactics and weapons, But these days, he can kind of look at a weapon and tell you what it is. And he can talk more about the individual personalities because he's been casting them for all this time. Like, he's definitely learning and getting better, as any good commentator should. But Nine was always the one who grounded that first roster of casters by being the color commentator who really knew, competitively speaking, what he was talking about. He wasn't just a casual Splatoon player. He was someone who has competed in tournaments just like the people he's casting. And Jordan and Ashley had not. They had played the game for sure, and they knew a good amount about it. And I think what Nintendo was going for there was twofold. One was that they wanted that extra structure that Jordan can provide by being this sort of pivot point who dictates how the cast goes. Jordan Kent would point out who was going to speak. And, like, you listen to Jordan Kent, you'll always hear him say the name of another caster before that other caster speaks. And that's how that caster knows not to collide with the other. And he's always the pivot point that it comes back to. So he'll say, Nine, what would you say these teams are trying to do? Nine would give his color commentary, and then it's just assumed that it's going back to Jordan after. He's like the master of ceremonies. He is the one who brings us from one caster to the other in the way that like the TV network host does. So there's a lot of value that he can bring in a situation where Nintendo has not done this before and does not know what kind of casting talent they're working with. For all Nintendo knew, we were going to be a bunch of edgelord teenagers who were just going to yell at the mic because that's what Freak did on the League of Legends broadcast, and we're not going to bring as much of value. Whereas with Jordan Kent leading in and setting the tone and deciding who speaks and when, we were starting to, follow his lead and go along with him. Him being the adult in the room, being the experienced, brand conscious person in the room, being someone who Nintendo really felt comfortable being on the mic and representing them as a company. So I think that tone setting is really valuable. That he also has the flow of a caster and is able to be entertaining without needing to know quite as much about the game. And so that was a great, bet for them in that regard. They kind of wanted to, I feel, prevent commentators from kind of getting out of pocket and yelling some things on the mic. That might be a bad look for Nintendo's brand. Now, this, I feel, it's not necessarily Nintendo's fault to be wary of that sort of thing, having seen how other esports scenes go. Now, if they were a little bit more in touch with the community, they'd probably know that most of our top casters and personalities and everything are more like kind of like disproportionately gay Christian youth pastors. Like, we're not wilding out that hard. We're a little bit more mainstream friendly, I would say, than a lot of other communities are. But they didn't know, and so they put in, these seasoned adults who are good at talking on the camera. And that was exactly what Jordan and Ashley were. They were really good at casting, even if you could look at them and be like, yeah, I can just hear that they don't really understand how the game works at a competitive level. It's fine, though. They did a good job on the cast. They kept it entertaining for the casual audience. And remember that the casual audience is most of who is watching this. But as time has gone on, Nintendo has started to trust us more and put more competitive players on there. And they've kind of had Jordan Kent coming back as this sort of anchor for them. But it's more Jordan Kent passing the baton to another competitive Splatoon player who's going to have a lot to say about this. And I think that the broadcast has generally been better for it. But I think that there are some shortcomings to this, because the pacing of having to go back to Jordan Kent, or whoever your anchor is, whoever your main caster is, the Jordan Kent of your group, pacing it this way doesn't leave a lot of easy space for someone to just get into a play-by-play rhythm. They don't really get into those Eminem rap god moments where they're just spitting out what's happening really fast, and it's just continuing to go, and it's continuing to crescendo, and then it's exploding into excitement, because at some point, it's going to have to go back to Jordan Kent. And Jordan Kent is going to pass it, Jordan Kent isn't just going to be a color commentator who interjects briefly and then lets you get back to it. Jordan Kent is first going to go to the other caster. They're going to say their piece, and then it's going to go back to Jordan Kent again before it comes back to you. So any momentum that you build up as an individual, as a play-by-play caster, is going to be interrupted not by one person, by one color commentator, who can just say a single sentence and match your energy and then get back out of the way and let you do your thing again. you're going to have to wait for 3 different people's spiels before you get to go back. And I think that interrupts the pacing to the point where we lose a lot of the excitement. We lose a lot of the momentum. It ends up feeling emphatic at times, but it never feels as passionate, I think, if we don't let it run away with itself like that. If we don't get to the point where we're yelling. And so that's one criticism that I have of it, that structure of it is inhibiting our ability to build and get fast and get loud. And I think another thing is that if we take a more grassroots approach to commentary, we don't have to care so much about being polished and professional. We don't need to care so much about there being, I don't want to say an adult in the room per se, because I think we still do kind of need maturity on the mic, but we can still afford to get loud. We can still afford to get excited on a level that I think Nintendo doesn't necessarily want representing the brand so much. They don't want people to take Super Smash Bros. As seriously as people take Super Smash Bros. This is a fact that's been established by their behavior over a very long period of time. So if we want to get excited about our game, then we don't want to do things the way that Nintendo does things, because it's actively inhibiting some of that excitement that we could be building in. We could be getting closer to those really loud CS or Valorant or League of Legends casts, but if we follow Nintendo's lead all the way, we're never going to get there, because that's not what they really want. On the inverse side of things, we could be getting something like the Wombo Combo. I talked about the Wombo Combo more recently, but it's been on my mind a lot because of the casting involved and how that is, on paper, some of the worst casting you've ever seen, but it's also extremely exciting. It's some of the best, play-by-play that's not even play-by-play that you've ever heard. It's something that makes you feel like you're in the room with them, getting excited with the combo at the same time that they are. And that's not a small event. That's not a small casting call. That's something that's gotten 20 million views on YouTube. Back from a time when this was like 2008 or something, when YouTube was much smaller. Back when this game was supposed to be dying because MLG had dropped it and its sequel was out. This game was even older then. It was only from 2001, and this is like 7 years later. It feels like it should be an old game. But this was a call that was so exciting that it inspired League of Legends to pick up the term Wombo Combo and start using it in their official casts. So, was it really unprofessional? Was it really unpolished? Sure. Was that bad? I don't think so. I think that there is space for us to be getting that excited about the game, and as long as we're conveying that energy in a way that's not immature, that's not annoying, and that's not harmful or condescending or mean to someone else. We don't make this trash talk, but we make this excitement and passion for the game. I think there's a lot of room for us to expand and be more than what we've been trying to be so far. I hope that this is inspiring to some casters to maybe try some new things. I hope this is inspiring, especially to broadcast and production people, to try and create new formats and try to create new effects by changing up the structure of your broadcasts and encouraging the casters to interact in different ways, giving them new information to use. There are a lot of different hands that play a role in painting a broadcast, and all of them can have an aesthetic effect on the final product. So I kind of want all of those different groups to be assembling around a more critically thought out theory of what they want that final broadcast to look like, so that we as a community can start developing more of our own voice than trying to imitate Nintendo, who, remember, is never really going to support esports on the level that a lot of us are passionate about, and that, if we want to grow past them, we need to be something more than just what Nintendo is. So absolutely, no hate to the people who are doing the Nintendo broadcasts, because, all those people who know what they're talking about, or, even, the Jordan Kents that are brought in who have not, up until this point, been a part of our community. First of all, they're getting the bag, right? They're probably getting paid by Nintendo to do this, I would imagine. And that by itself is really cool and really worth it. And they get to say, hey, Mom, look, I'm on Nintendo's stream. That's really awesome for them, and I love that for them. And the way that they're casting on those broadcasts absolutely makes sense for the task at hand. That's what they should be doing, is following what Nintendo wants them to do so that they put out the best broadcast for Nintendo and Nintendo wants them back. That's totally understandable, totally reasonable, correct. That is what they should be doing. But our other broadcasts do not need to be like those ones. And so we can experiment a little bit more and I think find something that will represent what's really at the heart of the Splatoon community better than even our own developers can really understand. Thanks for watching all of this, everybody. Hope you learned something. And Vimo.